Well, thank you, Chandra. It's wonderful to be here with Oregon Wild. And I have to say right off, this is not the world I imagined bringing this book into. Um, a few years ago, I was anxious to share the wonders of our rainforest with people who might not know the Pacific Northwest as a place more than calendar art scenery and maybe a problem with owls, but not much else. So I thought people needed an invitation to get to know this place so they could understand what's at stake way out here on this skinny stretch of rainforest in the far western edge of the continent. But even then, I could see the growing threat of facing our Northwest forests. But that worry at the time seemed sort of like distant thunder. But now that distant thunder is turns out to be a barrage of artillery aimed at our nation's forests, all of them. And this book has become an invitation to explore what it means to be a forest, any forest, in a rapidly shifting world. So,
So important.
yeah. Next slide.
All
And
right.
I'll
Yeah.
show
Yeah.
you.
Hey, could you like start out by telling us, I mean, in addition to that, what's the story behind the
Ah,
making of the book?
yeah, well, a lot of that has evolved as the political situation has evolved. But um, basically, I made my home in Western Oregon in the 1970s. And I worked first as a salmon biologist and later as a professor of science communication. But all along the way, I filled these sketchbooks, and you can show those next slide. Um, what I saw on the land as I was working across the PNW. So you'll see some of these sketches here tonight. But
Great. Well, why don't you ground us in exactly what rainforest region that we're talking about in this book?
okay, next slide will help. This is the Pacific temperate rainforest. That's the largest temperate rainforest in the world. But to a lot of people, the rainforest means the Amazon, which is a tropical rainforest, not a temperate. And when I show this map to people, I notice that a lot of people will see the redwoods down in California, and they'll see the Tongass up in Alaska, but they don't see the middle section. They don't notice Western Oregon, Western Washington. And so that's the so-called seasonal zone of the Pacific temperate rainforest. Um, but few people, possibly outside the audience for this website, realize that this place where we live is a rainforest. And even people who live here don't quite get that. But I have to say that people revere the redwoods and the Tongass, and they should. But to ignore the forests of Western Oregon and Western Washington is like telling a heroic story and leaving out some of the heroes. Our West Side forests are as venerable as any other in the world, but they are becoming threatened under a system that currently values them only as inventory for raw material. Their fate is up in the air as we speak, to be determined tomorrow by people in Washington, D.C. So we'll have more to say about this later in the webcast, but now I just want to fill in that overlooked story of this part of the temperate rainforest and perhaps inspire other people across the country to see their public forests as worth saving. So the next slide will show you where we are, right here.
I think I already jumped the gun, so it's up there.
No, this is it. You're
Oh,
good.
okay.
Yeah. This is the home. This is the forest of fire and rain. This is also the home of the northern spotted owl. And it's the home of the coastal Douglas fir forest. And it's the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people the cowlitz, the quinault, the swinomish, the nisqually, the klickitat, the alsea, the sala, the umpqua, and so many more native groups. And these are people whose ancestors were here long before the forests were here. So think about that for a minute. There's abundant evidence that people were here in Western Oregon more than 12,000 years ago, which is plenty of time to witness the continental ice sheets breaking up in Puget Sound in Western Washington, or Eastern Washington too. But those ice sheets never covered Western Oregon. But living right next door to an ice cube the size of a continent gave us a climate that was cold and dry. And as this ice sheet receded, the people who were here witnessed a radical change in the climate, from cold, dry tundra to a mix of hemlock, spruce, alder, and eventually to Douglas fir. So the next slide will show you that as the ice retreated, the salmon returned. And this was Salmon Nation. For hundreds of years before European settlement, this was a large, well-developed economy based on Pacific salmon. Before about the year 1800, the salmon industry in the Pacific Northwest was probably larger than the cod industry in New England at the same time. This was one of the most abundant sources of sustainable protein in the world, comparable to the vast bison herds in the Great Plains. And it didn't take long for my European ancestors to decimate that abundance. But let's go back to the rainforest right now. So next slide. This is the sweet spot of the Pacific temperate rainforest. Where we live is a place that's rainier than Northern California and more fire prone than soggy coastal Alaska. And it is a land of paradox. It's fire and rain. It's lava and ice. It's change and resilience. It's ancient and it's ephemeral. Despite all of the turmoil from thousands of years of disturbance, this forest has a distinctly benign climate to grow trees very old and very big. So these are Western red cedars from Olympic National Park. You can next slide. These are Sitka spruces at Cascade Head on the Oregon coast. So this is one of the few places, or one of the few temperate regions on Earth where the forests are filled primarily with conifers rather than deciduous trees. And man, we've got conifers. We have Sitka spruce, Western red cedar, Western hemlock are all the tallest of their kind in the world. And even our deciduous trees, big leaf maple, red alder, black cottonwood, are the tallest of their kind in all of North America. And the tree that gives this region its name, the coastal Douglas fir, is the second tallest tree of any species anywhere on the planet, second only to coast redwoods. So we've got this rainforest chock full of huge, heavy trees, living and death, and an underground life teeming with life. This rainforest stores massive amounts of carbon. So let's see. Yeah. One more thing. This rainforest is almost all on national forests, national parks, and BLM. It's truly a national treasure.
Yeah, all of those superlatives um, resonate, for anyone who's been in our forests. So, this book obviously it's exploring this particular region, this rainforest, but it's not written like a field guide that people might think of. So you take readers on an imagined field trip. So why did you choose that approach?
Well, to follow this story, you don't really need a map as much as you need your imagination. And that's because much of the forest that we see today has been reduced to plantations and tree farms, places where the trees are kept in arrested development and not allowed to grow beyond their um, late adolescence. It's rather dystopian, really. Um, but there are still beautiful stands of uncut rainforest out there, mostly on federal land. And this image here is from the Lewis River Trail in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. And there's stands like this throughout the region. They are remnants of one of the most magnificent forests on earth, with giant trees and prodigious growth that dominated Western Oregon and Western Washington until about the mid 1950s, really not that long ago, within my lifetime. So the forest that we explore in this book is a collage of naturally established, uncut stands of wild rainforest that still exist. And I refer to it as a wild forest because these stands have been allowed to establish on their own, grow up, possibly grow old, and regenerate in response to their own environment. So, next slide. Yeah, that's Waldo Lake. Wild forests sprout from the biological legacies left over from a fire, a flood, or some other kind of disturbance. Clear cuts and plantations don't allow that kind of legacy. But this picture of Waldo Lake is I sketched about a year after the 1996 fire killed 95% of the trees. And this is what most of our old growth forests looked like at the beginning of their lives. These wild forests know how to survive. So imagine right now that you're squeezed between a range of active volcanoes on one side and a massive, increasingly uncomfortable subduction zone on the other side. So you can see what happens. This is surrounded by a landscape that explodes and burns and floods. And it's a lively place here. It's born of fire, it's drenched in rain, and it's constantly changing. This is an intemperate rainforest. It's a wonderland with giant trees, exploding mountains, hidden underground kingdoms, disappearing owls, biblical floods, epic conflagrations across scales from molecules to mountains. And it's all born of fire and rain.
I love that description, Peg. It's great. So yeah, take us on this field trip. Take us to some of the places in the book that you imagine us visiting.
Okay. But the next slide, we can start right at the moment when a tree falls in the forest and there's no one around to salvage log it. The sound it makes is unseen underground economy. So a live tree has just a slender claim on being alive. It's just a thin layer of cells just under the bark that transport water and nutrients to the growing roots and leaves. But, next slide, a dead tree squirms with life. Fungi, bacteria, protozoa, insects are busy recycling old life back to the basics of new life. So this is the forest's recycling center. You can tell the next slide. It's also where much of the energy exchange and the community diversity lives. And here there are transactions of goods and services that are carried out in a wonderland like Alice's, with wild characters, bustling subterranean metropolis, building new life from the dismantled parts of old life. These inhabitants live fast with a high turnover. They require a lot of energy. So more than half of the energy from photosynthesis above goes down to feed these salvage operators down under. This is a world of life after death. And all this rot is a natural and essential process of the rainforest. It's a sign of forest health. But by the way, this diagram uses the subway system of Washington, D.C. So I'll leave it to you all to develop your own metaphor for that.
Well, yeah, I don't know that I've ever been on a forest field trip where I've gone underground. At least not really. So I'm glad we're using our imaginations here. Um, and you do have a whole chapter on sort of reimagining the region's geology, which you started talking about a little, as well as floating from the headwaters to an headwaters of a stream high in the mountains down to an estuary. So those are fun. But what about exploring the canopy? Can we go there too?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. This is a really fun place. I had ridden to the top of the forest canopy at the Wind River Experimental Forest years ago when the canopy crane was in place. And it was a thrill. It was like riding in an open air elevator and peeking through the windows of all the people's homes as you go up. You could see the changing species of lichens and ferns and birds as you make your way farther and farther up. And the air is getting warmer as you go up. So I imagined that experience as if you, the reader, were riding a molecule of air floating through all the layers of the canopy. And as you drift past red tree voles or sleepy flying squirrels, you witness the magic trick of photosynthesis. And you can poke around miniature forests, mosses and ferns and baby hemlocks growing hundreds of feet up in the air. You get pelted by mistletoe missiles, and you feel the turbulence of the atmosphere at the very top of the forest. So it really doesn't take much imagination to experience a wondrous world in the forest ecosystem.
I love that. And I know that you go into more detail than what you just said in the book. So I encourage people to take that trip. But despite it being really imaginative, the book is actually really deeply researched. You list more than 200 citations, which is great for readers who want to dive deeper. But you keep it lively and easy to read too.
Good, thank you. Well, it is a lively place, and the story is a lively story. But this story couldn't have been told without generations of scientists who have spent their lives studying and understanding this rainforest. And much of that research that we visit in this imagined field trip has been conducted by real scientists, particularly by a group of upstart researchers at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest in the Oregon Cascades. This is where the scientific study of old growth first took root. So, taking the long view of forests, the Andrews scientists rejected the idea that these forests should be managed like a crop. They opened our eyes to the complexity of these large, muscular forests that proliferate across the flanks of steep, unstable, disturbance-driven landscapes. So you can see these guys, these forest scientists introduced a new way to make environmental policy that put science first. Their groundbreaking discoveries challenged America's 200-year engine of industrial forestry and resulted in the Northwest Forest Plan. And it was when I was working with the Andrews researchers in the Oregon Cascades and with the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology on the Oregon coast that I began to pour into the relationship of art and science. So both art and science begin with wonder. And as a verb, wonder it means to speculate, to hypothesize, to cogitate, to observe, to wonder. As a noun, wonder is more akin to awe and astonishment, mystery, magic, wonder. But in both senses, a sense of wonder cultivates the ability to notice details and delight in discovery. Western science is really good at producing a ton of data, but those data need to reflect real landscapes and real lives. And you have to go outside and into the forest to see exactly what all those pixels really represent. So I call those moments stop, drop, and draw. And in this book, the illustrations serve sort of that same purpose, and you can show the next one. It's an opportunity for readers to stop for a moment, as you might stop on a forest trail to look closely at, say, a dipper hunting in a stream. Wonder puts art and science on the same path. Well, it's true, the scenery of the rainforest is wonderful to look at, with crystal clear streams and volcanic towers and moss-draped trees. But if you enter the forest with some understanding of how the ecosystem actually lives, you become part of something much bigger than scenery. Your knowledge expands wonder and prepares you for discovery. And that's when the details emerge. That's when patterns come to light. That's suddenly the scenery materializes into a story with subplots, ecosystem relationships, and characters, and drama, and intrigues. Take the saga of the northern spotted owl, just for example. We are currently facing a heartbreaking and possibly hopeless choice of shooting barred owls to save the northern spotted owls. And let me assure you that nobody wants to do this. And so instead we debate over owl genetics and trigger words like native or invasive. But I think more telling is to graph a timeline of the first sightings of barred owls recorded in the West. And I believe that these sightings are accurate because, well, if there was an 18-inch owl who's active during the day with a conspicuous "who cooks for you," somebody's going to notice it. And somebody did. Barred owls were first recorded in northern British Columbia in around 1950. and in southern British Columbia around 1960. And in Western Washington in 1973, and in Oregon and Northern California around the mid 1980s. So consider these 35 years, the mid 20th century, and you can hear the trees getting cut down. The barred owl showed up right after the chainsaw. We carved them up, welcome mat, right through the northern spotted owl's home in our urgency to eliminate old growth forests. And we keep cutting down these trees, losing more habitat with every timber sale.
Well, Peg, sorry that I was just thinking about a panel at the environmental law conference this weekend that I went to about the barred owl and spotted owl, and it's sad. Um, so then on to a different, maybe sad topic or front of mind, I guess, for folks. We've got images of wildfires in, urban areas fresh on our minds. So what about fire in our rainforests? You talked about it being born in fire and that being a natural starting point for many of our forests today. But what have you included in the book about that?
Well, thinking about Los Angeles, like Los Angeles, the fires that we get here, the worst ones are blown into firestorms by fierce east winds, similar to what happened in Los Angeles. But unlike in Los Angeles, our wild, wet rainforests don't burn easily. And why is that? Because they're wet. Our temperate rainforest has a deep, damp layer of living soil, heavy downed logs that absorb water like sponges, and big standing trees that are armored with fire-resistant bark. And the whole thing is covered in thick, wet blankets of moss and ferns. So our forests don't burn easily, but when they do burn, that fire can be fierce. And it's not because there are too many trees. It's because there's too much wind. Fire weather in our forest is a formula with a long-term drought, with high air temperatures, with low air humidity, and a spark, say a lightning strike. And you can see why climate change is delivering more fire weather to us. But it is a hot, dry, hurricane force east wind that can blow that spark into an inferno. And you can't stop a wind-blown firestorm, but you can prepare for it. So a lot of people these days are now saying we should treat wind-blown wildfires the same way we treat tornadoes or earthquakes or hurricanes. They're big, destructive events that cannot be controlled, but they can be prepared for. So we should prepare for the inevitable wind-blown fire and fireproof our communities with materials and landscapes that will not burn. Our rainforest has endured all kinds of upheavals, including fire and a changing climate. The forest knows how to survive. But recently, we talked about this at the law conference, there's been a flurry of proposed new bills calling for increased logging in the national forests in the name of fire prevention. Well, this isn't going to work here. Thinning out some trees makes a forest more susceptible, makes a rainforest more susceptible to fire, not less. Well, how can that be? Well, it's because when you thin out some trees, you open the rainforest up to more sun, more wind, and higher rates, unusually high rates of drying. And you compact that soil and damage that damp underground life of roots and mycorrhizae. And you remove the moisture holding logs and leave behind piles of broken kindling. But maybe worst of all, thinning the rainforest often removes some big standing trees too. These are the most fire resistant trees in the forest. And they get cut down in order to pay for the logging of the smaller trees. And that's logging that doesn't need to happen in the first place. So it's frustrating because wildfire is a deadly serious issue, and it shouldn't be used as a political scare tactic to log our remaining rainforest. So I think it's a different situation. Not quite there yet, but that's okay. I think it's a different situation in the drier, fire adapted forests east of Cascades, where managers do sometimes thin out younger trees from crowded, fire suppressed stands in conjunction with prescribed burning. Smokey the Bear was very effective and left many of those fire dependent forests crowded and dangerously starved for fire. But this rainforest is not starved for fire. It's not part of the fire nurtured Western landscape that is east of here. And yet, that difference between west and east, wet and dry, is being willfully overlooked in new legislation to encourage more logging in our federal forests. Now, now here's an example for you. It's called Fix Our Forests Act. And the language itself is a smokescreen. This bill will empower land managers and agencies to use science-based tools to restore health to our nation's forests. Well, that sounds great. How? Well, by bypassing critical environmental laws in order to expedite logging and to reduce so-called frivolous lawsuits that might interfere with timber sales. And by restricting the input of the public, who have a right to review public land decisions. And by restricting input from scientific experts who know more than anybody else the consequences of these proposed actions. And as for building community protections against wildfire, well, this bill promises some collaboration, coordination, but I saw little or no funding for building defensible space and home hardening. So this is not about community protections. It's not about forest health. It's about logging. And there's more, but wait, there's more. Even more blatant than Fix Our Forests is this new executive order that was announced just this weekend that allows the Forest Service and the BLM to ignore environmental protection laws simply to increase logging in federal forests. And there is no smokescreen in this proposal. It doesn't even pretend to be about fire protection. It seems just to be an obvious gift to the timber industry, who has been waiting for 30 years to get back in the Northwest forest and continue logging big trees. Sorry.
Yeah, we've been reeling at some of these escalating assaults on public land, and the public employees who care for it, Peg. So, and you mentioned this at the beginning, but I imagine this is not the world you expected to bring your book into, because it is an imaginative, celebration, and of this rainforest. So how's that going? How are you doing?
That's a question we're all asking each other these days. But I wrote this book at a time when the Biden administration was putting out some hopeful forest legislation. But even those proposals were beginning to sour even before the November election. So my hope now is to offer this book as a helpful primer to help people understand that this forest is more than an inventory and is not a threat to public safety. I think it's critical for all of us to understand how forest ecosystems really work, because we see decision makers exploiting the public fear of wildfire to fling open the door to industrial logging, to suspend environmental laws, and to muzzle the public's right to question the management of public land. The federal agencies are being dismantled, and the federal scientists are being thrown out like trash. But we need our federal scientists, and we need our environmental lawyers, and we need our advocates like Oregon Wild to help us protect the laws that were meant to protect our future. I'll finish just by saying this. This rainforest, and you can go to the next slide because it's a pretty one. This rainforest is on public land, and we have a say in its future. And it is worth more standing than cut down. So I want to thank all of you for being here, and I'm going to hand this over to Chandra. She can explain more about what Oregon Wild is doing to help us secure the future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Peg. And as a reminder, if anyone has questions for Peg or something comes up while I'm talking about some of Oregon Wild's work, use the Q&A box and we'll get to those in a few minutes. So Peg, you already made a pretty poignant plea for why we need to care about these forests and where we are in this moment for them. So I just want to reassure folks that we at Oregon Wild have definitely been feeling these many threats thrown at us for our public lands and forests over the past month or so. And in this moment, in these moments, it's important to recognize that we are here together. We're in it together to not only appreciate and learn about our rainforests, but also recognizing that it's important that we take action together as well. It can be really powerful to do so. So we can't be hopeless when we're doing something, what we can for these amazing ecosystems. So yeah, you already mentioned a few of the hot points that I'm going to hit here. And I'll try to keep this action oriented for folks, and then we can get to the Q&A. But yeah, as Peg mentioned, just this weekend, the Trump administration issued 2 new executive orders targeting our forests. They're basically blatantly prioritizing industrial logging over all other uses or values for our public forest lands. And the other order manufactures a national security crisis to justify this logging. It can't just skirt environmental laws, but what it does is directs federal agencies to find ways to weaken key environmental protections under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and the Endangered Species Act. And it seeks to end any kind of policy or even legal settlement that is in place that might place any undue burdens on timber production. So yeah, as Peg said, the mask is definitely off here. It's very clearly about prioritizing logging over other things in our national forests. It's not couched as protecting us from wildfire like some other recent threats have been doing. And the whole thing, is legally dubious. We have our lawyers working on on figuring out if there are some hooks for fighting these executive orders. And, you know, in combination with the systemic dismantling of agency staff and structure, and, you know, this sets a reckless path forward for the future of our public lands. So what we can do right now is get loud about this, as well as all the other things that we're, you know, standing up for at rallies and town halls, et cetera. We need to contact our congressional representatives and senators so that they know that we care about this issue in addition to all the other things. So we're asking people to do that. Oregon Wild has an action that you'll be seeing either in your inbox, or we do have it live on our website right now as well. And we will be doing, as I mentioned at the beginning, a webcast in 2 weeks on March 19th that walks through this executive order and whatever comes up between now and then, and the various things that tools and tips that we can use to take some action and use our advocacy, our grassroots advocacy, to protect our forests. We also need to do what we can, you know, here in our backyard, in our own rainforests, and the places that we know and love best. So these executive orders issued last week or this weekend could very well inform the outcome of the Northwest Forest Plan amendment that we've been talking so much about with you, our audience. But right now we're still analyzing how that might play out, and it might take a little time to really understand how those orders might influence the outcome. But in the meantime, the comment period on the Northwest Forest Plan Amendment ends on March 17th. And so it's more important than ever that in light of this new potential direction, that we make our voices heard. So if you haven't already, you know, ad nauseum heard about the Northwest Forest Plan Amendment and the ways to sign our petition or offer your own individual personalized comment, you'll get follow-up information after this, but also can find it on our website. It's vitally important that we speak up for the things that we support in what's being proposed, including tribes and indigenous knowledge and management of our forests, but also the things that are really problematic, such as increasing logging in our mature forests that are becoming our next old growth. And one final action, Peg mentioned the Fix Our Forests Act at the end there. And, you know, I talked about this at last week's webinar too. But this dubiously named bill, it's HB 471, as it passed the House of Representatives in Congress. It has a hearing in the Senate, in a Senate committee tomorrow, Thursday. And so we are asking folks to send a message to their senators to oppose this bill. Senator Wyden and Merkley here in Oregon are not on that committee, but it's still important that they hear from you that you don't want them to support it in case it gets fast-tracked after that. And they can also talk to their colleagues. As Peg mentioned, this bill increases logging under the guise of reducing fire risk without actually investing in real solutions to protect communities like, you know, home hardening and you know, sort of firewizing our homes and communities. So there's real problems with it. And yeah, if folks can take action tonight afterwards, call your senators or sign our petition or in our email before tomorrow, that'd be great. But we'll keep you posted on any next steps coming out of that bill as well. All right. Well, now's the time where we have some questions. So we've got about 10 minutes left, which is awesome. Sometimes we go a little long, so I'm glad that we have time. And Phoenix, if you wanted to help us out by pitching the first good question that you have determined, that would be awesome.
Okay. Well, first of all, Peg, that was amazing. Just you're so well spoken and the art was beautiful and it was yeah, I really did feel like I was on the field trip. We got a lot of really good questions. Um let's see.
I'll just say I'm seeing a lot of praise for the art and the
Yeah.
presentation. So
I'm like scanning through the comments trying to like find there's a lot of yeah. Okay. Okay, so this first one, it's gonna just, we've been touching on the political comments a little bit more. So, will the BLM land be threatened more because of the tariffs being imposed on Canadian lumber? And Chandra, that might be one a little bit more for you, but I figured while we ended with political, we'll get to that one, and then I'll dig into stuff a little bit more for Peg.
Yeah, I mean, I'm don't fully understand how all of this tariff stuff works, but that is kind of that definitely is tied to these new executive orders. That's the manufactured national security risk that is included in it. Essentially, I think setting it up so that if that basically setting it up so that our forests should be the ones that are used for all of our lumber needs, and impose tariffs on other countries' lumber so that it gives incentive and creates this crisis, so that we have to log more on our public land. So yes, the answer is that our BLM land most certainly will be more threatened. But not necessarily because of the tariffs, but because of the way that they've set it all up.
Yeah,
Yeah,
my
as I
understanding of it. Oh, sorry, Peg, you go ahead.
as I understand, creating a national emergency, out of thin air allows the environmental laws to be suspended much more easily. So logging is easier to do, but there's absolutely no talk about recycling wood, conservation of wood. It's just matching growing quantities of lumber from Canada or the US. Both are in danger of overcutting, and it's not a hot potato. It's a matter of finding new ways to use wood more effectively, efficiently, so we don't need to keep cutting down old trees.
And then Peg, I had two different questions that came through in relation to either your art or you making another sort of book. So some people do want to know if your artwork is available as a poster, and some other people want to know if you've thought about adapting it into a children's version of the book.
Um, no, for the first answer, it's not available anywhere but the book. So you'll have to cut up the book and paste it together to get your poster. The second question is a funny one because this book was preceded by a children's book that my friend Judy Lee and I wrote many years ago called Ellie's Log. And it was the exploration by a couple of 10-year-old kids into the H.J. Andrews experimental forest to learn about forest ecology and the old growth forest. That book was so well received among teachers and parents and kids that we chose to do 3 more children's books on 3 other ecosystems across Oregon. One on the east side, which focused on fire ecology, one on the ocean that focused on ocean conservation, and one in an urban area, an urban wildlife. They were written for middle readers because it's those grades that the teachers are asked to do environmental science. But the materials they used to teach about forests were teaching about the Amazon, or teach about the ocean, and they were teaching about the Great Barrier Reef. The teachers had no Oregon-based curriculum to use in their environmental education. So now they have 4 books and probably many, many more than that.
Oh, that's so fantastic to root kids in their environment and realize, like growing up, you hear about exploring the world and you hear about all these faraway places, which are wonderful, but discovering the wonder in your own backyard, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So this person wants to know about the forest industry's ability to mill old growth and protection strategies for the second growth and the old stands that are still around. So the Forest Service can't, so to wrap that up, the Forest Service, can they log old growth? And then what's our best way forward to try and protect the forest we still have?
Well, I think first of all, we got to clarify the Forest Service doesn't log anything. Forest Service manages these public forests that are publicly owned. They're just managers, and they arrange timber sales that independent private companies come in and bid on. The independent logging companies are the ones who do the cutting. And yeah, it's a little slippery. You've got a stand of, funky looking trees and doing, I mean, wild forests are really tangled and lovely, but you might have one big old 500-year-old tree in the middle there. As I understand, you can cut all the way around, just don't cut that old tree. There are rules. The Northwest Forest Plan did a heroic job of trying to protect stands, areas of mature and old trees. But that's getting whittled away now. And so the amendments to the Northwest Forest Plan really don't look that much better at protecting old stands. There's some good things in there, but I've been surprised in the last 10 years to see how much new logging there is on public forests, despite the protections that apparently are in statute.
To the question about mills and old growth, it's true that most mills in the Pacific Northwest actually retooled years and years ago to only deal with smaller trees, like the second growth in our plantation forests that were clear cut in the past. But there are still some that can take large diameter trees and, in fact, prefer that for the products that they make. And so there's still plenty of demand out there. And then, if you can retool once, perhaps you can retool again.
Yeah, I feel like if they retooled once, it'd probably be easy to do again. But this last one is less of a question, but I think, Peg, you probably have some interesting thoughts on it. Paul wanted you to talk about either human-caused fires or salmon bringing in nutrients from the ocean, and what like a beautiful connection that makes between the forest and the ocean.
Yeah. Okay, human-caused fires. There is plenty of evidence that there were indigenous burning in the rainforest. The fire scars are there, and the evidence that fire was used to enhance hazel stands and different kinds of food, just the way they were used in the drier parts to enhance acorns. This was all food-based to make the land produce those first foods. It was very gentle fire. But when we took the Native Americans off their land, we took fire off the land as well. And so the effect is not dramatic in the rainforest because those fires were very small. They maybe rarely did kick up with an east wind and spread catastrophically, but the fire scars seem to be relatively small and contained within hazel groves or whatever. And your second question had to do with salmon, which is a lovely story. It's about this isotope of nitrogen that is found mainly in aquatic environments. It's picked up by salmon while they're in the ocean. And when they come into the forest streams and way up into the forest to spawn, they die. They get picked up by bears or somebody, and the carcasses are distributed around. And that nitrogen isotope, that marine-based nitrogen, is then picked up and incorporated into the wood of trees. It's a lovely story. And I think it's probably a big factor, a measurable factor in the Coast Range, where you have massive salmon runs, or we used to, and we could again. But the salmon runs aren't quite as prolific, never were, in the Cascades. So I think, like a lot of these stories, they have regional importance, but not necessarily uniformly spread across the whole ecosystem.
Thanks. Well, we're at 7 o'clock. So thanks everyone for your questions and comments and encouragement and for taking action. Thanks so much, Peg, for sharing your beautiful artwork and your story with us. And folks, go out and find Peg's book if you don't win it in our raffle. And hope to see you all in the woods, or at a rally, or taking action some other way. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a
Thank
good
you
night.
all. Bye-bye.